So to put the TPP in perspective, and what this is really about, it helps to go back a little bit in history. So I'm going to take us back for a moment to 1933, when the corporate oligarchs of this country decided that they didn't have enough oligarchical power, that when the big corporations and the ruling elites were unhappy with President Roosevelt, and decided that they wanted to cut out the middleman and wanted to run the country directly. So they went to a guy by the name of Smedley Darlington Butler, the most decorated military man in the country at the time, and they made him an offer. They told him they wanted him to be their guy to knock out Roosevelt and put them in charge of the country directly. Well, fortunately for all of us, Smedley Darlington Butler was a patriot, was not willing to overthrow his government, and went to Congress and to the administration, told them about this plot. It was investigated. Congress found it to be not just a crazy conspiracy, but a credible rumor, or credible conspiracy. No charges were pressed, but it in fact emboldened, some say, President Roosevelt to move ahead with the New Deal, and the corporate media, for their part, dismissed it as crazy nonsense and tried to discredit Smedley Butler, because we know who they were working for. History repeats itself, as we'll see later on in that regard. So the corporations after that decided that they needed to use more of a Trojan horse to take over the country. And so they start, as these things often do, they started doing it in pieces. So after World War II, the administration started pushing a thing called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Now this was one of the innovations of the Bretton Woods Conference. It was supposed to, the idea was to create a global trade agreement that would eventually lead to the creation of a global trade organization, an international trade organization. And but one of the innovations herein was that this was not just going to be about what trade agreements were normally about. You know, we lower our tariff on your wine, and you lower your tariff on our wheat. This was going to deal with things that were not normally part of trade agreements. The so-called non-tariff issues, non-tariff barriers to trade. Well, what is that? That's a nice term. That means our domestic legislation, the things that might block a product from being imported because it's against our laws, things like our food safety laws, our environmental protection laws, our labor protection laws. Well, Congress started recognizing that what was happening here was an attempt to circumvent the legislature. So while Congress reluctantly delegated to the president power to deal with the actual trade aspects of this GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, they held off on committing to all these other little pieces. Well, that went along until the 70s, when our old friend Tricky Dick introduced a thing called fast track. And when he tried to sell this to labor at first, saying, hey, these non-tariff barriers was really blocking your exports. Labor at the time was actually trying to push for some very progressive legislation that would have raised global labor standards, would have actually put concrete requirements on imports, bringing them up to a higher level, actually using trade as a tool to advance economic rights and social justice and labor rights, instead of doing the opposite. So President Nixon said, no, this non-tariff thing is where we need to go. And for a short while, labor almost believed him, but very soon they realized that it was a double cross. So labor came out against this fast track thing. Unfortunately, Congress passed it, and now we had a way of doing trade that said that the president could negotiate trade agreements, didn't have to go to Congress first to get permission as to who they were supposed to negotiate with, could pretty much write the executive branch could pretty much write the whole damn thing themselves, throw in all sorts of things that had nothing to do with trade, and then bring it back to Congress like this. Hey, Congress, here's this piece of legislation. You have 90 days to vote on it. At the end of 90 days, you can vote it up, you can vote it down. You can't hold it up in committee. You only have 20 hours to have hearings on it. You can't amend a damn thing. No period, no comma can be changed. And at the end of that, you have to have a vote, which means that for 90 days, everyone in Congress is hearing from every corporate lobbyist you can imagine. Meanwhile, they haven't even had a chance to look at this thing. I mean, you need a team of lawyers and economists to even understand what these things are about, and they have 90 days basically to do anything with it, to deliberate and try to make heads or tails of the things. So basically, it's designed as a ramrod. So using that method, President Reagan decided that these trade agreements would be a great backdoor to get through all kinds of pieces of his anti-regulatory agenda. And then in the early 90s, we see the rise of NAFTA. And NAFTA made a bad thing worse. With NAFTA, they brought in this idea of investor-state dispute resolution. And what this meant was that we were now giving foreign corporations more power than our own government. Under investor state, a foreign company could sue our government when our domestic public interest laws interfered with their profits, their future profits. So a company could say one of our public interest laws is preventing them from all the money they might make in the future. So they can now sue us for all the money they think they might have made. It's basically a way for corporations to supersede democracy and basically extort money out of our government. So obviously this is a great thing for the corporations, and both George H.W. and Bill Clinton were all too happy to oblige. And so once they had this in place with NAFTA, they tried to expand it. They wanted this kind of corporate rule trade agreement globally. And so in Seattle in 1999, they had a big meeting of the World Trade Organization, which was the metastasized form of GATT. GATT turned into a malignant tumor. The International Trade Organization they really wanted, where they were going to take what they'd already started with the WTO in '95 and make it even worse. Well, thankfully, some of us got wind of that, some of the people's movements of this country and the world, and probably in an unprecedented way, at least in this country's history, labor united in the streets with environmentalists, anti-hunger activists, with AIDS activists, anarchists, with liberals, pretty much just about everyone who saw that the corporations were making a massive power grab to just put themselves in charge in the same way that they did in 1933, and realized that we had to all get together to stop them. Well, we did stop the expansion of the WTO in Seattle. And then again, the Bush administration tried to kind of do the same thing, a smaller piece. They had a thing called the Free Trade Area of the Americas, to basically put a free trade agreement to make it absolutely clear that the U.S. was going to run this hemisphere on behalf of its corporations, goddammit, as it had been doing for pretty much already the last 200 years, but let's make it official. Well, that fell apart too because of massive resistance throughout the Americas. They then tried to go ahead with some smaller trade agreements, a country here, a country there, and passed a trade agreement with Colombia, Panama, Peru, Singapore, a very large trade agreement with South Korea, which has already led to significant U.S. job losses, even though it's only been in effect for 2 years. So President Obama, in 2008, campaigned vigorously on the idea that he was the one candidate who was against NAFTA. He sent out mailers against Hillary Clinton with shuttered factory gates, linking Hillary Clinton to the Clinton administration's NAFTA policy. Well, it leaked that while he was doing that, he had an advisor up in Canada telling the Canadian government that this was all just campaign rhetoric, and that actually leaked during the primaries. As soon as the primary was over, he pretty much came out and said that flat out. So then when he was elected, he started singing a very different tune than all that nice rhetoric on NAFTA. So in 2011, he passed 3 trade agreements that George Bush II had left on the table, hadn't been able to get through Congress. Obama could do it. So we ended up with these trade agreements with Panama, South Korea, and Colombia. And then, now for the last 5 years, emboldened by that victory, they've been negotiating something even bigger and badder, which is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This is a trade agreement with 40% of the global economy. It includes Japan, Singapore, Canada, US, Chile, Peru, Australia, Mexico, New Zealand, Malaysia, Brunei, Vietnam, I'm probably moving this way. And it is pretty much everything that we've seen about these past trade agreements made worse. The negotiations for this are currently underway and being conducted in secret. You can't see the negotiating text. I can't see the negotiating text. After raising a big stink, members of Congress have on a very limited basis been able to see the text. They can go into a room. They can't take notes. Staff has extremely limited access. And this is straight from Alan Grayson. You basically